Welcome to my channel Deep Sleep Mission-DSM. As we begin, I would be delighted if you could share your location in the comments below. It's truly inspiring to witness how far this content travels and to connect with viewers from across the world. The first time I saw Margaret Thompson's name carved into granite, she was still very much alive, working her shift at the county courthouse just 3 blocks away from Willowbrook Cemetery. But there it was, etched in perfect Times New Roman font. Margaret Thompson, 1967 to 2024, beloved wife and mother. The date of death? This Friday. Today is Wednesday. I should probably explain how I ended up in this mess. My name is David Chen, and I've been the groundskeeper at Willowbrook Cemetery in Millfield, Ohio for the past 8 years. It's honest work, quiet, predictable, and it pays the bills for my small apartment above Mrs. Henderson's bakery on Maple Street. The job comes with its quirks, sure, like the way fog rolls in every Tuesday morning without fail, or how the old oak tree near Section C always drops its leaves in perfect circles. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I discovered last Friday afternoon. What if I told you that someone has been visiting graves that don't exist yet? And what if I told you that every single person whose name appears on those phantom headstones dies exactly 7 days later? Would you believe me? Because after what I've witnessed over the past month, I'm not even sure I believe myself anymore. This is the story of the Friday Cemetery visitor, and why I'm terrified that my name might be next on her list. The story is now going to start. It began on a Friday in late October, the kind of day where the air bites just enough to make you pull your jacket tighter, and the leaves crunch under your boots with that satisfying autumn sound. I was doing my usual end-of-week rounds, checking for any damage from the previous night's windstorm, making sure the irrigation system was functioning properly, and ensuring all the flower arrangements from recent services were still presentable. Willowbrook Cemetery spans about 40 acres of rolling hills dotted with centuries-old maple trees and weathered headstones. It's divided into sections A through H, with the newer additions spreading toward the back where the land slopes down toward Miller's Creek. I've walked these paths thousands of times. I know every pothole in the gravel road, every loose stone on every grave, every squeaky gate hinge that needs oil. But that Friday, something was different. I was near Section F, the newer area where most of the plots are still empty, when I noticed fresh flowers. Bright yellow chrysanthemums and white roses, the kind they sell at Patterson's florist downtown for $12 a bouquet. They were arranged neatly at the base of what looked like a headstone. But here's the thing, there was no headstone there. Just an empty plot of grass that hadn't been sold or assigned to anyone. I stopped my utility cart and climbed out, thinking maybe someone had accidentally placed flowers on the wrong grave. It happens more often than you'd think. Grief makes people disoriented, and all the headstones can start to look similar when you're not thinking clearly. But as I got closer, I realized this wasn't a mistake. There were flowers. Fresh, expensive flowers, arranged perfectly on a grave that didn't exist. I knelt down and ran my hand over the grass where the flowers lay. The ground felt different somehow, softer, like it had been recently disturbed, though there were no visible signs of digging. The grass was perfectly level, perfectly green, but underneath my palm it felt hollow, empty. That's when I saw her. An elderly woman, maybe 75 or 80, walking slowly down the gravel path with a small watering can in one hand and what looked like a garden trowel in the other. She was dressed neatly in a navy blue coat and sensible walking shoes, the kind my grandmother used to wear to church every Sunday. Her silver hair was pulled back in a perfect bun, and she moved with the careful, measured steps of someone who had made this walk many times before. She didn't see me at first. I was partially hidden behind one of the larger maple trees, and she seemed focused on her destination. But as she got closer, I noticed something odd about her route. she wasn't following the main path. Instead, she was cutting across sections of the cemetery where there were no graves, walking in a straight line toward a specific spot in Section G. I followed her at a distance, staying behind trees and larger monuments to avoid being seen. I told myself I was just being cautious, making sure she wasn't vandalizing anything or causing damage to the grounds. But honestly, I was curious. In 8 years of working at Willowbrook, I had never seen this woman before. She stopped at another empty plot. No headstone, no marker, just grass. But she knelt down anyway and began arranging a small bouquet of white lilies with the same care and precision someone might use when tending to their spouse's grave. She whispered something under her breath. Too quiet for me to hear from my hiding spot behind a large granite angel. Then she did something that made my blood run cold. She pulled out a small piece of paper from her coat pocket and placed it where a headstone should be. The paper was folded neatly, and from where I was standing, it looked like it had writing on it. She weighted it down with a small stone, stood up slowly, and brushed the dirt off her knees. For a moment, she just stood there. Her head was bowed and her lips were moving in what looked like a prayer. The afternoon sun filtered through the maple leaves, casting dancing shadows across her face. There was something profoundly sad about the scene, something that made me feel like I was intruding on a deeply personal moment. Then she turned and walked away, following the same impossible straight line back toward the cemetery entrance. I waited until she was completely out of sight before approaching the spot where she had been kneeling. The flowers were beautiful, clearly expensive and freshly cut, but it was the piece of paper that made my hands shake as I reached for it. The paper was thick, expensive stationery with a watermark I couldn't quite make out, written in careful blue ink, in handwriting that reminded me of old-fashioned calligraphy lessons, was a name and date: Robert Kellerman, October 31st, 2024. Robert Kellerman, I knew that name. He owned the hardware store on Main Street, the one where I bought my work gloves and lawnmower parts. A nice guy, maybe 65 years old, who always asked about my mother when I came in. He had a wife named Linda and 2 grown kids who lived somewhere out in California. October 31st was 6 days away. I should have left it alone. I should have thrown the paper away, told myself it was just some eccentric old woman with a strange hobby, and gone back to my normal routine of mowing grass and cleaning headstones. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because something about that moment, the precision of her movements, the sadness in her posture, the expensive flowers on an empty grave, it all felt too deliberate to be random. So I did something I had never done in 8 years of working at Willowbrook. I started paying attention. The next Friday, I made sure to be in Section F around the same time I had seen her the week before. 3:30 in the afternoon, when the light was starting to fade and most visitors had gone home for the day. I positioned myself near the maintenance shed where I had a clear view of the entire cemetery while remaining hidden. She came. Same navy blue coat, same careful walk, same watering can and garden trowel. But this time, she went to 3 different locations, 3 empty plots in 3 different sections of the cemetery. At each spot, she left flowers and a folded piece of paper weighted down with a small stone. After she left, I collected all 3 papers. Margaret Thompson, November 8th, 2024. James Morrison, November 15th, 2024. Susan Walsh, November 22nd, 2024. I recognized all 3 names. Margaret worked at the courthouse. James ran the gas station on Highway 12. Susan taught 3rd grade at Millfield Elementary. My nephew Tommy was in her class. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Robert Kellerman and the date on that first piece of paper. October 31st, Halloween. 4 days away. On Tuesday, I drove past Kellerman's hardware store on my way to work. The open sign was lit, and through the window, I could see Robert behind the counter, helping a customer select paint colors. He looked perfectly healthy, perfectly normal, perfectly alive. Wednesday, the same thing. Robert was there, rearranging a display of snow shovels in preparation for winter. Thursday morning, I almost convinced myself I was losing my mind. This whole thing was ridiculous. People don't predict deaths by leaving flowers on empty graves. That's not how the world works. But around lunchtime, I found myself driving past the hardware store again. The closed sign was up, in the middle of the day, on a Thursday. I parked across the street and watched the store for 20 minutes. No movement inside, no lights except the emergency exit signs. I was about to leave when Linda Kellerman's car pulled into the parking lot. Even from across the street, I could see that she had been crying. She unlocked the front door and went inside. 5 minutes later, she came back out carrying a box of what looked like personal items. Photos, a coffee mug, a small cactus in a terracotta pot. The kind of things you take when you're not planning to come back for a while. That evening, I checked the Millfield Gazette's website. Nothing. No obituaries, no news about Robert Kellerman. But the hardware store remained closed on Friday, and Saturday, and Sunday. On Monday morning, the obituary appeared online. Robert James Kellerman, 65, passed away peacefully on October 31st, 2024, surrounded by family after a brief illness. Services will be held at October 31st, exactly 7 days after the elderly woman had left that piece of paper on an empty grave. I printed out the obituary and stared at it for a long time. The rational part of my mind kept insisting this was just a coincidence. People die every day. Elderly women visit cemeteries all the time. The fact that she had somehow guessed the right date was just luck. Bad luck, but still just luck. But the other part of my mind, the part that remembered the hollow feeling of the ground beneath my palm, the precision of her movements, the sadness in her posture, that part wasn't buying it. That part wanted to know what was going to happen to Margaret Thompson on November 8th. Margaret Thompson was a creature of habit. Every morning at 7:15, she walked from her small house on Cedar Street to the Millfield County Courthouse, where she had worked as a clerk for the past 12 years. She brought lunch from home, usually a sandwich and an apple, and ate at her desk while reading romance novels. She drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic that she parked in the same spot every day, and she always wore a small silver cross necklace that caught the light when she leaned forward to stamp documents. I knew all of this because I had started watching her. Not in a creepy way. At least, I told myself it wasn't creepy. I was trying to understand what connection she might have to the elderly woman who had written her name on that piece of paper. Maybe they were related. Maybe Margaret owed her money. Maybe there was some logical explanation for why someone would predict her death date with such confidence. November 8th was a Friday, 2 weeks after Robert Kellerman's death, 1 week after I had found that second batch of papers at the cemetery. I had been watching Margaret's routine for 6 days, and she seemed normal, healthy, maybe a little tired looking, but who isn't tired these days? On Wednesday, November 6th, I was driving past the courthouse around noon when I saw her collapse. It happened right on the front steps. One moment she was walking down toward the street, probably heading to Patterson's florist to buy flowers for the weekend like she did every Wednesday. The next moment, she was on the ground, her purse scattered across the concrete, her silver cross necklace glinting in the autumn sunlight. Several people rushed to help her. Someone called an ambulance. By the time the paramedics arrived, Margaret was conscious but disoriented. I watched from my car as they loaded her onto a stretcher and drove away, sirens wailing. That evening, I called the hospital using a fake name and claiming to be her cousin from out of town. The nurse was sympathetic, but couldn't give me specific details due to privacy laws. She could only say that Margaret was stable but undergoing tests. Thursday passed with no news. The courthouse was closed on Friday for a staff training day, something that had been scheduled months in advance, according to the sign on the front door. I drove past Margaret's house on Cedar Street multiple times throughout the day.
Her car wasn't in the driveway. Saturday morning, I found the obituary. Margaret Rose Thompson, 57, passed away peacefully on November 8, 2024, at Millfield General Hospital after a brief illness. She was preceded in death by November 8th, exactly 7 days after the piece of paper had been left on that empty grave. I sat in my kitchen, staring at the obituary on my laptop screen, and tried to make sense of what was happening. 2 people, 2 exact dates, 2 deaths that had been predicted a week in advance by an elderly woman who left flowers on graves that didn't exist yet. The rational explanations were getting harder and harder to believe. Maybe she was poisoning people somehow. But how? I had never seen her interact with Robert or Margaret. Maybe she had access to medical records. But that didn't explain how she knew they would die on specific dates. Maybe she was just incredibly lucky at guessing. But the odds of that were astronomical. Or maybe something else was going on. Something that didn't fit into the rational world of cause and effect that I had always believed in. I needed to know more about James Morrison. According to the paper I'd found, he was supposed to die on November 15th. That gave me exactly 1 week to figure out what was happening, and maybe find a way to stop it. James Morrison owned Morrison's Gas and Go on Highway 12, about 3 miles outside of Millfield. It was one of those old-fashioned service stations where they still pumped your gas for you if you asked nicely. And the coffee was always fresh because James made a new pot every 2 hours whether he needed to or not. He was maybe 55, with graying hair and laugh lines around his eyes from 40 years of dealing with customers who were having car trouble. I started stopping there for gas every other day. Not enough to seem suspicious, but enough to observe his routine and his health. James seemed fine. He moved a little slowly, probably arthritis from years of physical work, but he was alert, friendly, and showed no signs of illness. On Tuesday, November 12th, 3 days before the predicted date, I was filling up my tank when I overheard James on the phone with someone. His voice was tight with worry. "No, I understand, but Thursday is too soon. I need more time to get my affairs in order. Yes, I know what the doctor said, but..." He noticed me listening and turned away, lowering his voice. But I had heard enough. "Doctor, affairs in order. Thursday would be November 14th, 1 day before the date on the paper." That evening, I did something that probably crossed several ethical lines. I called Morrison's Gas and Go and pretended to be from his insurance company, claiming we needed to verify some information for his policy renewal. James was polite, but clearly tired. "Look, I appreciate you calling, but I'm dealing with some health issues right now. Can we do this next week?" "Of course, Mr. Morrison. I hope everything works out okay." "Yeah, me too. The surgery is scheduled for Thursday, and the doctor says... Well, he says we caught it early, so that's good, right?" Surgery. On Thursday, November 14th. 1 day before November 15th, the date the elderly woman had written on that piece of paper. I hung up the phone and sat in the dark in my apartment, listening to the sounds of Millfield settling in for the night. Mrs. Henderson's bakery ovens hummed to life downstairs, preparing for the next day's bread. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, the sounds of a world where people don't predict deaths by leaving flowers on empty graves. But that world was starting to feel very far away. James Morrison died at 3:47 a.m. on November 15th, 2024. Post-operative complications, according to the official report. The surgery on Thursday had gone well. The doctors had successfully removed a small tumor from his intestine, and the prognosis had been optimistic. But sometime during the night, his blood pressure dropped suddenly, and despite the medical team's best efforts, they couldn't save him. I learned all of this from the obituary that appeared in the Millfield Gazette on Saturday morning. The funeral would be held the following Tuesday at St. Mary's Catholic Church, with burial at Willowbrook Cemetery. Willowbrook Cemetery. My cemetery. James Morrison would be buried in Section D, Plot 47, which I had helped prepare that very morning. But here's what haunted me. What kept me awake for 3 straight nights after reading that obituary. James Morrison wasn't supposed to die from post-operative complications. He was supposed to die from whatever that elderly woman had predicted when she left flowers on an empty grave. The surgery was just coincidence. Bad timing. A perfectly rational explanation that happened to align with an impossible prediction. Wasn't it? Friday afternoon came again, the 3rd Friday since I had first seen her. I positioned myself in the same spot near the maintenance shed, but this time I had a plan. This time, I wasn't just going to watch. This time, I was going to get answers. She arrived at exactly 3:30, just like before. Same navy blue coat, same careful walk, same watering can and garden trowel. But there was something different about her today. She moved more slowly, and even from a distance, I could see that her shoulders were hunched with exhaustion. Or maybe sadness. She went to 2 locations this time. The first was in Section H, near the back of the cemetery where the newer plots were still mostly empty. The second was in Section B, among some of the older headstones where the marble had been worn smooth by decades of weather. After she left the second bouquet and its accompanying piece of paper, I stepped out from behind the maintenance shed. "Excuse me." She turned around slowly, and I got my first clear look at her face. She was older than I had initially thought. Probably closer to 85. Her skin was deeply lined, but her eyes were sharp and bright blue. There was something familiar about her features, though I couldn't place where I might have seen her before. "You're the groundskeeper," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. David Chen. I've been working here for 8 years. She nodded and adjusted her grip on the watering can. "You've been watching me." Again, not a question. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but I forced myself to maintain eye contact. "Yes, ma'am, I have. I need to know. I need to understand what you're doing here." For a long moment she didn't respond. She just stood there studying my face with those sharp blue eyes. The afternoon wind rustled through the maple trees, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the sound of traffic on Highway 12. "You collected the papers," she said finally. "Yes. And you've been checking on them. Robert, Margaret, James." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "Yes." She sighed and set down her watering can. "Then you know. I know they're dead. I know they died exactly when you said they would. I know you somehow predicted their deaths a week in advance. What I don't know is how, or why." She was quiet for so long that I started to think she wasn't going to answer. But then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, she extracted a small, faded photograph and handed it to me. The photo showed a young woman, maybe 25 years old, with dark hair and bright blue eyes. She was wearing a nurse's uniform and standing in front of what looked like a hospital. On the back, in the same careful handwriting I had seen on the papers, was written, "Eleanor Whitmore, 1962. "That's me," she said quietly. 62 years ago, I was a hospice nurse at Millfield General Hospital." Eleanor Whitmore. I tried to remember if I had ever heard that name before, but nothing came to mind. "For 30 years I helped people die," she continued. "Not in a bad way, in a peaceful way. I held their hands and made sure they weren't alone. I learned to recognize the signs. The way someone's breathing changes, the way their skin gets cold, the way their eyes look when they're ready to let go." She took the photograph back and tucked it into her wallet. "After I retired, I thought I was done with death. I thought I could have a normal life, tend my garden, read books, visit my grandchildren. But the knowing, it didn't stop. If anything, it got stronger." "The knowing?" Eleanor looked past me toward the cemetery gates, where the last rays of afternoon sunlight were filtering through the iron railings. I can see when someone is going to die. Not how, not why, just when. It started about 5 years ago. I would be at the grocery store and I would look at the cashier and just know she had 2 weeks. Or I would be at church and I would see Mrs. Peterson in the pew ahead of me, and I would know she had 3 days. My mouth was dry. And you're always right? Always. She picked up her watering can. At first, I tried to warn people. I called Margaret Thompson's sister and told her Margaret was going to die. The sister hung up on me and threatened to call the police. I sent an anonymous letter to Robert Kellerman's wife, suggesting she encourage him to see a doctor. She threw it away. So you started leaving flowers instead. They deserve to be remembered, Eleanor said simply. Even if they don't know it yet, even if no one believes me, they deserve to have someone who cares enough to bring them flowers and say their names out loud. I stared at her, trying to process what she was telling me. But you're just leaving flowers on empty graves. There's no one there to remember. Eleanor's smile was infinitely sad. There will be. She started walking toward the cemetery entrance, moving with that same careful, measured pace. I followed her, my mind racing with questions. The 2 papers you left today? I called after her. Who are they for? She stopped walking but didn't turn around. Susan Walsh, November 22nd. And? When she finally turned to face me, I saw something in her eyes that made my blood freeze. David Chen, December 13th. That was 3 weeks ago. Today is December 10th. Susan Walsh died exactly when Eleanor predicted. A car accident on Route 9, just outside of town. The funeral was yesterday. I helped prepare the grave in Section C, Plot 23. I've spent the last 3 weeks trying to figure out how to change what's supposed to happen to me in 3 days. I've seen doctors. I've had tests. I've avoided driving, avoided dangerous activities, avoided anything that might lead to an accident or injury. But deep down, I know it won't matter. Eleanor Whitmore knows things, impossible things, and she's never been wrong. I've been visiting her house on Pine Street every few days, trying to understand more about her gift, or curse. She makes tea and tells me stories about the people she's helped over the years. She's kind, gentle, and genuinely sorry about what she sees in my future. But she can't change it any more than I can. The flowers aren't a prediction, she told me yesterday. They're a promise that someone will remember, a promise that the death won't be meaningless. Today is my last day as groundskeeper at Willowbrook Cemetery. I've trained my replacement, a nice guy named Marcus who doesn't ask too many questions about why I'm leaving so suddenly. I've cleaned out my apartment, paid my bills, and written letters to the few people who might wonder what happened to me. Tomorrow, I'm going to drive to Eleanor's house one more time. I want to thank her for the kindness she showed me, even though her gift brought nothing but terror into my life. I want to understand why she does what she does, knowing how much pain it causes. And on December 13th, well, we'll see what happens on December 13th. But here's what I keep thinking about. What keeps me awake at night staring at the ceiling. Eleanor said she's been able to see deaths for 5 years now. 5 years of knowing exactly when people are going to die. 5 years of leaving flowers on empty graves and watching her predictions come true. But she never told me when she started seeing her own death. And she never told me who's going to be leaving flowers on her grave. What do you think really happened to David? Was Eleanor's gift real? Or was there something more sinister going on in Millfield? And most importantly, if you were in David's position, what would you do with 3 days left? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will keep you up at night wondering what's real and what's not. Story number 2. The GPS coordinates haven't changed in 43 years. Neither has the weather report for Kaktovik Village. Population 287. Temperature -12. Wind speed 15 knots. The only problem is, Kaktovik Village hasn't existed since 1981, yet every morning at 5:47 a.m., my flight manifest updates itself with delivery requests from people who shouldn't be alive. If you're listening to this, you need to know why I still fly those routes, and why I can never, ever stop. Story begins. My name is Jake Morrison, and 3 months ago, I inherited the worst gift anyone could receive: a 1962 de Havilland Beaver floatplane and a set of flight routes through the Alaskan wilderness that my Uncle Charlie flew for 43 years. The lawyer's office in Anchorage smelled like burnt coffee and old paper when he handed me the keys. "Your uncle was very specific," he said, pushing his glasses up his nose. "The routes must continue, no matter what." I almost laughed. Almost.
Charlie had been the kind of bush pilot they write books about, flying medical supplies to remote villages, delivering mail to research stations, rescuing hikers from places helicopters couldn't reach. When I was a kid visiting from Seattle, he'd let me sit in the co-pilot seat, teaching me about updrafts and crosswinds while we soared over glaciers that looked like frozen rivers of light. But something changed after his wife Martha died in 2019. His letters got stranger. His phone calls came at odd hours, always talking about keeping the schedule and not disappointing them. The last time I saw him was at Thanksgiving. He looked thin, haunted, kept checking his watch and muttering about delivery windows. Mom thought it was early dementia. Dad said it was grief. Nobody said it was fear. The float plane sat in a hangar at Lake Hood Seaplane Base, looking exactly as I remembered. Faded red paint with Morrison Air Service stenciled in white on the fuselage. Inside, everything was meticulous. Updated avionics, fresh leather seats, and a laminated route map taped to the dashboard. 7 villages were marked with red circles: Kaktovik, Shungnak, Nikolsky, Chitina, Eagle, Chicken, and one simply labeled North. I knew most of these places. Tiny communities scattered across Alaska like seeds thrown by a careless hand. But when I checked them against current maps, something was wrong. 3 of them didn't exist anymore. Kaktovik had been abandoned after a fire in 1981. Nikolsky evacuated due to volcanic activity in 1995. And north, there was nothing at those coordinates but empty tundra. The manifest clipboard hung on a nail beside the pilot's seat. Fresh delivery requests. Dated today, Mrs. Henderson in Kaktovik needed antibiotics. Tom Bridges in Nikolsky ordered canned goods. Someone in North requested. The handwriting was smudged, but it looked like warmth that first night in Charlie's hangar. I found things that made my skin crawl, hidden behind a false panel in his desk. Dozens of Polaroid photographs, but these weren't vacation snapshots or family memories. Each photo showed empty spaces, vacant lots, demolished buildings, cleared forests, but written on the back in Charlie's careful handwriting were notes that didn't make sense. Henderson's house, still cooking dinner. Main Street, children still playing. The old church, Sunday service at 3 p.m. I held one photo up to the light, just an empty field covered in snow. But the back read, Nikolsky School, Miss Carver, still teaching 4th grade, requests new chalk. The timestamp on the photo was from last month. 2 years after I'd personally confirmed Nikolsky was nothing but ash and memory. That's when I found Charlie's recording equipment. Reel-to-reel tapes stacked in milk crates, each labeled with dates and coordinates. I picked one at random. October 15th, 2018, Kaktovik Village. The tape hissed to life. Charlie's voice, strained and tired. Supply drop complete. Mrs. Henderson confirms the medicine is working, but she's asking questions I can't answer. Wants to know why her granddaughter never ages. Why the calendar in the post office has been stuck on March 3rd, 1981 for 37 years. His voice broke slightly. I tried to tell her, tried to explain, but how do you tell someone they're living in the echo of their own death? That their entire world exists only because someone remembers to visit it? Static crackled. Then Charlie's voice again, quieter now. Something's wrong with the village today. The loop is degrading. I saw the Hendersons' dog get hit by the same truck 3 times in 10 minutes. Each time. It would yelp, die, then reset and run into the street again. Mrs. Henderson didn't notice. None of them notice when the loop glitches. A chill ran down my spine as I listened to more tapes. Hours of recordings. Charlie documenting the slow decay of impossible places. Villages where time moved in circles, where the same conversations happened daily, where the same accidents occurred on schedule, where the dead continued their routines without knowing they'd stopped living. I should have walked away, should have sold the plane, torn up the roots, gone back to my IT job in Seattle. But Charlie's voice echoed in my memory. Some responsibilities choose you, Jake, and once they do, you can't unchoose them. That first morning, I loaded the plane with supplies from the warehouse Charlie had been using. Everything was paid for. Organized, labeled, antibiotics for Mrs. Henderson, canned peaches, beans, and coffee for Tom Bridges, and for North, a single wool blanket, wrapped in plastic. The Beaver's engine coughed to life like an old dog waking from sleep. Lake Hood stretched before me, dark water rippling with the promise of rain. Other pilots were doing their pre-flight checks, normal people flying to normal places. I wasn't one of them anymore. The flight to Kaktovik should have taken 4 hours. The GPS showed the village coordinates clearly, but as I flew north, the landscape began to feel wrong. Mountains appeared where my charts showed valleys. Rivers ran backward from their marked directions. The magnetic compass spun lazily, as if it had given up trying to find north. But it was the radio that truly unnerved me. What started as normal air traffic chatter slowly transformed into something else entirely. Voices speaking languages that hurt to hear. Flight numbers that contained letters, symbols, sounds that shouldn't exist in human speech. November 70 Whiskey requesting permission to land at coordinates that taste like copper. Delta. Alpha reporting fuel levels holding steady at impossible. This is Flight Scream 77 requesting vectors to the place where lost children wait. I tried changing frequencies, but every channel carried the same impossible transmissions. And underneath it all, a sound like breathing, slow, patient, ancient breathing that seemed to come from the plane itself. The fuel gauge began behaving strangely too, sometimes showing full, sometimes empty, sometimes displaying symbols that weren't numbers. At one point it read "soon" in flickering red letters before snapping back to normal. Then, through a break in the clouds, I saw it, Kaktovik Village, exactly as it had been in the photos from the 1970s. Wooden buildings clustered around a small airstrip. Smoke rising from chimneys, a few trucks moving along the main street. My rational mind screamed that this was impossible. The village had burned. I'd seen the newspaper articles, the insurance reports, but there it was, as real as the stick in my hand and the engine noise in my ears. I circled once, twice, looking for signs of, what, decay? Abandonment? Some indication that this was a movie set or a hallucination. But the windsock was full, pointing northeast. The runway had fresh tire marks, and standing at the edge of the strip, a figure in a heavy parka waved me down. Landing a float plane on a dirt strip requires special wheels. Charlie's Beaver had them. Of course it did. The touchdown was smooth, practiced, as if the plane knew this approach by heart. The figure in the parka walked toward me as I powered down. An elderly woman, indigenous features weathered by decades of Arctic wind. She smiled, and her teeth were too white, too perfect. "You must be Jake," she said, and her voice carried despite the engine's dying rumble. "Charlie told us you'd come." "Charlie's dead," I said, the words catching in my throat. Her smile never wavered. "Yes, he is, but he kept his promise, and now you're here." She introduced herself as Mrs. Henderson, the same Mrs. Henderson who'd ordered antibiotics. She looked exactly like the photos in Charlie's old albums, except those photos were from 1979. "How?" I started, but she raised a mittened hand. "The medicine first." She said, "Questions later, if you still have them." I handed her the antibiotics. Her fingers were ice cold through the thick mittens, and when our hands touched, I felt something electric, ancient, hungry. The village behind her was impossibly normal. Kids played in the snow. Men worked on snowmobiles. A dog barked at something only it could see, but underneath the normalcy, something was wrong. The shadows fell at incorrect angles. The smoke from chimneys drifted against the wind, and the children playing. They moved in patterns, the same snowball fight over and over, like a recording stuck on loop. As Mrs. Henderson walked away, I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. Her footprints in the snow. They weren't quite right. Instead of the expected boot-shaped impressions, her tracks looked like burn marks, charred outlines in the white snow that smoldered faintly as I watched. The village itself seemed to flicker when I wasn't looking directly at it. Peripheral vision caught buildings phasing in and out of existence. A truck that appeared solid from the front showed daylight through its engine block when viewed from the side. Children's laughter echoed from empty lots. But what terrified me most was the consistency of their routines. I watched for 20 minutes, and the same sequence repeated exactly. A man in a red flannel shirt walked from the store to the gas station, spent precisely 3 minutes there, then walked back. A woman hung laundry that was already dry. A child threw the same stick for the same dog, which fetched it with the same enthusiasm. And every 4 minutes and 37 seconds, a church bell tolled 3 times. Even though there was no church, "We need these supplies," Mrs. Henderson said, clutching the medicine. "Without them, we fade." Charlie understood. "He kept us whole." "Kept you whole?" My voice cracked like a teenager's. "You're not. You can't be. Real?" She laughed, and it sounded like wind through broken windows. "We're as real as memory. Jake, as real as obligation, as real as the roots your uncle flew." She turned and walked back toward the village. At the boundary of the airstrip, she stopped. "The others are waiting." She called back, "Don't disappoint them. The consequences." She didn't finish. I wanted to follow her, to demand answers, but my feet wouldn't move. Something about crossing that boundary, entering the village proper, felt like a line I couldn't uncross. I got back in the plane. The engine started immediately, eager to leave as I taxied for takeoff. I saw them. The entire village had come out to watch. Men, women, children, all standing perfectly still, all smiling those 2 white smiles, all waving in perfect synchronization. The takeoff was rough, the plane bucking like it was flying through invisible walls. When I looked back, Kaktovik was gone, just empty tundra and the marks of a fire that had burned 43 years ago. The flight to Nikolsky was worse. The clouds formed shapes that shouldn't exist. Faces, hands, entire bodies of vapor reaching for the plane. The radio crackled with static that almost sounded like voices, pleading, warning, threatening. but it was what I heard between the static that made my hands shake on the controls. Charlie's voice, faint, distorted, but unmistakably his. "Jake, don't trust the compass. Magnetic north isn't where they say, follow the cold, always follow the cold." The temperature gauge in the cockpit dropped 20 degrees in seconds. Ice formed on the inside of the windows despite the heater running full blast. And through the frost, I saw them. Other planes, dozens of them, flying in formation through the clouds around me. Old planes, new planes, military bombers from the 40s, modern Cessnas, all flying the same route, all piloted by shadows. One pulled alongside me, a vintage Piper Cub with Hamilton Air Service painted on the side. The pilot turned to look at me, and where his face should have been was just darkness. A void shaped like a man, wearing a leather jacket from the 1950s. He held up a clipboard, pointed at it urgently. Then his plane banked hard left and disappeared into a cloud that shouldn't have been there. My own manifest clipboard rattled against its nail. New entries were appearing as I watched, written in different hands, different inks, some in languages I didn't recognize, deliveries to places that hurt to read, coordinates that made my eyes water. The terminal station, the Upside Church, Nowhere, Arkansas, the city of Dis. Nikolsky appeared through a gap in the weather like a photograph developing in reverse. First the edges, then the details. Then the impossible reality of a village that had been buried under volcanic ash in 995. Tom Bridges met me at the dock. He was younger than Mrs. Henderson, maybe 50, with eyes that didn't quite focus on the same point. His handshake was firm but wrong, like shaking hands with someone through thick glass. "Appreciate the supplies, Jake," he said, unloading the canned goods. "Been 3 weeks since Charlie's last run. We were getting..." He paused, searching for a word. "Thin? You ever forget something important?" Tom asked, stacking cans on a rusted cart, like a name or a face, but you know it's there, just out of reach? That's what happens when the supplies don't come. We start forgetting ourselves, start becoming just echo. Behind him, Nikolsky looked like a double-exposed photograph. Buildings solid one moment, translucent the next. People walking through walls, disappearing mid-stride, reappearing blocks away. Charlie figured it out. Tom continued. "The supplies. They're not really antibiotics or food. They're attention, memory, belief. Every time someone flies these routes, acknowledges we exist, we get a little more real." "But you're not real," I said, though the words felt hollow. "You're all dead." Tom's laugh was bitter. "Dead's a strong word. Jake, we're discontinued, like a TV show that got canceled but keeps playing in syndication. As long as someone's watching, we exist." He finished unloading and pushed the cart toward the village. "Better get to north before dark," he said without looking back. "They've been waiting the longest, and they're the hungriest." The coordinates for north led to nothing. Empty tundra stretching to the horizon. No buildings, no runway, no signs of life. But the GPS insisted I was there, and the fuel gauge said I needed to land. I circled for 10 minutes, looking for anything. Then I noticed the silence. Complete, absolute silence. No wind, no engine noise, no sound at all. Even my own breathing seemed muffled. Wrong. The altimeter was spinning wildly, showing impossible readings. 10,000 feet, 500 feet, undefined. That's when I saw it. A shadow on the snow that didn't match anything above it. A rectangular darkness that suggested a runway that wasn't there. But as I descended, reality began to warp around me. The sky turned purple at the edges. stars appeared in broad daylight, but they were wrong stars. Constellations that spelled out words in languages that predated human speech. And the cold, God. The cold, not just physical cold, but something deeper. The cold of empty space, of forgotten graves, of love that died before it could be spoken. Landing on nothing requires faith or insanity. I had run out of the first and was embracing the second. The wheels touched something solid where my eyes saw only snow. The plane rolled to a stop in empty air. And then they came. Not people, not anymore. Shapes of static and snow, outlines of what had been human. They moved like stop-motion animation. Jerky, unnatural, wrong. The leader, if you could call it that, reached for the blanket with hands made of television snow. When it touched the wool, it solidified slightly. Features emerged from the static. A young man, maybe 25, wearing a military uniform from World War II. Weather station. His voice was like radio interference. Classified. 1943. Forgotten. Abandoned. Starved. The others pressed closer. A dozen shapes yearning for form. The single blanket passed between them, each one gaining a moment of solidity before fading back to static. Need more, the soldier said. Charlie brought more. Warmth, memory, life. I don't understand, I said, backing toward the plane. What are you? What is this place? Liminal, he said, the word breaking apart like a bad connection. Between channels, between states, between... The static grew louder, angrier. The shapes pressed closer, reaching. I ran, threw myself into the plane, started the engine with shaking hands. The takeoff was violent, the plane lifting through grasping static that left frost patterns on the windows, patterns that looked like screaming faces. I flew back to Anchorage in silence. The radio was dead, the GPS spinning wildly, but the plane knew the way home, following invisible roads through darkening sky. That night, I couldn't go back to my hotel. Something about being alone, enclosed, vulnerable. Instead, I stayed in the hangar office, surrounded by Charlie's life. The walls were covered with maps. Not just Alaska, but everywhere. Red pins marked locations. Hundreds of them, some in places I knew, others in oceans, in deserts, in the middle of cities. Each pin had a string leading to a note card. Lost 1953, forgotten 1987, erased 1999. One pin sat in the middle of Lake Michigan. The card read, Peshtigo Relief Ship, 1871. Still sailing, still searching for survivors. Another in the Amazon, Missionary Colony, 1923. They found something else to worship. Downtown Manhattan had 3 pins clustered together. Subway station, platform 13, never officially existed. Passengers still waiting. I pulled out my laptop, started researching. Every location had a story, a tragedy, a disappearance, a collective forgetting. The Peshtigo fire had killed more people than the Chicago fire on the same day, but nobody remembered it. The missionary colony had sent one last radio transmission. God is different here. The Manhattan subway blueprints showed Platform 13, but it was never built. Or was it? Charlie's journals were in chronological order, each one meticulously detailed. At first, normal deliveries to normal places. Then, in 1981, the first mention of Kaktovik after the fire. But I found something else, letters, hundreds of them, bound with rubber bands. The first was dated 1962, the year Charlie got his pilot's license. Dear Mr. Morrison, We at the Bureau of Liminal Affairs appreciate your interest in our advertised position. Bush pilots with your qualifications are rare. The routes you'll be flying are essential to national security, or perhaps we should say, reality security. Please report to the coordinates provided. Ask for Mr. Gray. He doesn't exist, but he'll find you. The Bureau of Liminal Affairs. I searched online. Nothing. No records. No mentions. No conspiracy theories even. It didn't exist. Or it existed in the same way Kaktovik existed. More letters followed. Instructions for deliveries. Warnings about certain routes and payments. Charlie had been paid well. Very well. The money came from accounts that didn't exist at banks that had never been built. One letter stood out, dated just a month before Charlie died. Mr. Morrison, your nephew has been selected as your replacement. He doesn't know it yet. Won't know it until you're gone. But the routes must continue. The alternatives are unacceptable. We've seen what happens when the forgotten get too hungry. Detroit, 1967. Watts, 1965. They called them riots. We know better. That was just the forgotten trying to be remembered. Violently. Your nephew is strong. He'll understand. Or he'll learn. Either way, the routes continue. My hands shook as I set the letter down. Selected? I'd been selected? A sound outside made me freeze. Footsteps on gravel, slow, measured, wrong. The doorknob turned. A man entered who looked like he'd stepped out of a 1950s government PSA. Gray suit, gray tie, gray hair. Even his skin had a grayish tint. Mr. Gray, I presumed. Hello. Jake. His voice was like old paper rustling. I see you've been reading. Good. Context helps. Who are you? I managed. I'm nobody, he said, sitting in Charlie's old chair. Literally, I'm a government employee who was never hired by an agency that doesn't exist to manage problems that can't be real. I'm what happens when bureaucracy becomes self-aware. He pulled out a cigarette that smelled like burning memories. Your uncle was the best we had, he continued. 43 years without a major incident. Do you know how rare that is? Most pilots last 5 years before they try to stop. Then we have to... He paused. Replace them, messily. You're threatening me? No. He smiled, and his teeth were the same gray as everything else. I'm explaining. You've already seen what happens when deliveries are late. They get thin, desperate. Some of them start wandering, looking for acknowledgement, for proof they existed. He stood, walked to the map. See this pin in Portland? He pointed to Oregon. 1997. Pilot decided to stop flying. 3 days later, half a neighborhood reported seeing deceased relatives in their homes. Police called it mass hysteria. We called it a containment breach. This one in Denver, another pin. 2003, trucker stopped driving his routes. Week later, an entire abandoned mall materialized in downtown, full of shoppers from 1985, still shopping, still trying to buy things from stores that didn't exist. Took us 6 months to fade them back out. He turned to me. You're not prisoners. Jake, you're antibodies. You keep the infection of forgetting from spreading. You maintain the quarantine between what is and what was. And if I refuse... Mr. Gray walked to the door, paused. Then you become one of them, he said simply. The forgotten forget themselves first. Charlie knew that. Why do you think he kept flying even when his body was failing? He was terrified of forgetting, of becoming something that needed deliveries. He left, and I noticed the cigarette butt he'd dropped had already faded from existence. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, the static people, the 2 white smiles, the shadows where faces should be. Charlie's final journals told the complete story. 43 years of maintaining the impossible, of keeping the forgotten stable, contained, fed on acknowledgement and supplies. They needed me. He wrote, "Still need supplies. Can't abandon them." The entries grew more frantic over the years. Villages that shouldn't exist, people who weren't quite right, and always the compulsion to continue. They're trapped. He wrote in 2018, between death and disappearance, between memory and forgetting. The routes keep them stable, without the flights. They dissolve into nothing. Or worse, they come looking. The final entry was dated 3 days before his death. Jake will understand. He has to. They know about him now. They're waiting. If he doesn't fly, they'll come south. They'll look for what they need. And Anchorage has so many people who won't be missed. I wanted to burn it all. The plane, the routes, the journals. But that night, the dreams started. Mrs. Henderson standing in my Seattle apartment, fading in and out like bad reception. Tom Bridges at my coffee shop, translucent, desperate. And the static shapes from north pressed against my windows, spelling out words in frost. Tomorrow, fly, or we come. The next morning, the manifest had updated itself. More supplies needed, more villages added to the route, places I'd never heard of, coordinates that shouldn't exist. I loaded the plane with whatever they requested. Medicine, food, blankets, books, toys, each item a tether to existence, a weight against oblivion. The flights became routine, impossible routine. Villages that existed only when observed. People who were memories wearing human masks. And always, the hunger for acknowledgement, for proof they hadn't been forgotten. Some days, new villages appeared. Ghost towns, abandoned camps, forgotten outposts, all populated by those who fell through the cracks of history, all dependent on my deliveries to maintain their fragile existence. And I understood Charlie's fear, because if I stopped, if I refused to fly, they wouldn't simply fade away. They'd come for what they needed. And in a world that creates forgotten places every day, that loses people in the margins, that erases entire communities from memory, they'd never run out of food. 3 months I've been flying these routes. 3 months of delivering supplies to the discontinued, the erased, the forgotten, and every flight. The manifest grows longer. New coordinates appear. New villages materialize from nothing. Yesterday, I saw something that made my blood freeze. A new entry on the manifest. Coordinates I recognized. My childhood home in Tacoma. The house that burned when I was 12. The house where the request was simple. Toys for Emma. Emma, my sister's name. My sister who died in that fire. I haven't flown that route yet. But the coordinates pulse on my GPS, and last night, I heard her voice on the radio, singing the song she used to sing, asking why I haven't visited, asking why I abandoned her tomorrow. I fly to Tacoma, or what's left of it in that other space, that liminal gap where the forgotten wait. And I need to know, if you're listening to this, if you've ever lost someone, someplace, something that should have been remembered. Check your maps. Check the coordinates where they should be. Because Charlie wasn't the only bush pilot flying these routes. There are others. Truck drivers on abandoned highways, ship captains on forgotten seas, train conductors on discontinued lines. We're the ones who keep the forgotten from becoming hungry. We're the ones who maintain the barriers. And we're running out of supplies. So I need to ask you something. And think carefully before you answer. Have you noticed places in your town that feel wrong? Empty lots that give you chills? Abandoned buildings where shadows move without sources? Those aren't empty. They're waiting. And if you've noticed them, they've noticed you. Sleep tight. And whatever you do, don't research the coordinates of places that no longer exist. Because once you know where they are, they know where you are too.